The forest was supposed to be silent at this hour. Mark had always loved the way the Alaskan wilderness felt at dawn, still, untouched, sacred. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the damp earth and the occasional rustle of wind through towering pines. It was peaceful, tranquil. But then, out of nowhere, the silence shattered. A deep, guttural cry echoed through the trees. Mark froze mid-step. It wasn't the sharp yelp of a coyote or the haunting call of an owl. This was something else. Something massive. A sound thick with agony. His heartbeat quickened. He adjusted the strap of his camera bag and took a cautious step forward. The cry came again. Louder this time. Closer. His instincts screamed at him to turn back. There were plenty of predators out here, wolves, mountain lions, maybe even a rogue grizzly. And yet, something about the sound wasn't predatory. It was desperate. Mark took a deep breath. Against his better judgment, he followed the noise. The terrain grew rougher, thick roots clawing up from the earth like the grasping fingers of buried giants. Sunlight barely cut through the dense canopy, casting eerie shadows that shifted with every step. The cries grew more sporadic now, shallow, weak. Whatever was out there was losing strength. Then he saw it. A grizzly bear. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The animal was massive, even larger than he'd imagined, easily over 8 feet tall if it were standing. But it wasn't standing. It was slumped on its side, panting heavily, its body trembling. That's when Mark saw the source of its suffering. A rusted, steel poacher's trap clamped around the bear's hind leg, the jagged metal teeth biting deep into its flesh. Blood seeped into the dirt, forming dark, muddy pools beneath its body. The bear let out another low, pain-filled moan, its chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. Mark swallowed hard. This was bad. Very bad. Every survival instinct in his body told him to leave, now. A trapped animal was the most dangerous kind. Pain and fear made even the gentlest creatures unpredictable. And this was no small creature. This was a bear, one swipe away from turning him into nothing more than a cautionary tale. But then he met its eyes. Dark, intelligent, filled with something Mark didn't expect. Fear. Real raw fear. The bear wasn't growling. It wasn't snarling. It was just looking at him. And in that moment, something shifted in Mark's chest. It needed help. His hands trembled as he reached for his multi-tool. This is insane, he muttered under his breath. Insane, reckless. And yet he couldn't walk away. Carefully he took another step forward, his voice low and steady. Easy, big guy. I'm not here to hurt you. The bear's ears flicked, its muscles twitching as if debating whether to trust him or lash out. Mark knew he had minutes, maybe seconds, before panic set in. And once he touched that trap, there would be no turning back. Mark's fingers tightened around the handle of his multi-tool. His breath came slow and controlled, but inside, his heart was hammering against his ribs like a warning drum. He was standing just a few feet from a grizzly bear, an injured, desperate grizzly bear. Any wrong move could be his last. The bear's dark eyes flickered between Mark and the trap around its leg. Its massive chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, nostrils flaring as it took in his scent. Mark knew it could probably smell his fear. Easy, big guy, he whispered again, his voice barely louder than the rustling leaves. I'm just here to help. The bear let out a low, guttural huff. Mark's legs felt like lead as he took another cautious step forward. The scent of blood and rusted metal filled the air, sharp and bitter. Up close, he could see the true damage. The steel teeth of the trap had dug deep into the bear's flesh, cutting through fur and muscle. The wound was swollen, raw, and dangerously infected. This bear didn't have much time. Mark crouched down slowly, his every movement calculated. The bear tensed but didn't lash out. That was a good sign. He slid his pack off his shoulders and unzipped it, pulling out a thick cloth. If he could wrap part of the trap, maybe he could avoid cutting himself in the process. The bear growled softly, shifting its weight. Mark froze, his muscles locking. This was it. Would it trust him? Or see him as a threat? The bear's massive paw flexed, claws sinking into the dirt. Its breathing hitched, and for a split second, Mark braced himself for the worst. But then, the bear did something unexpected. It looked away. A slow, deliberate act of trust. It wasn't a surrender, it was an understanding. Mark's pulse roared in his ears. He swallowed the lump in his throat and got to work. He positioned the cloth over the rusted metal, hands trembling slightly as he pried his multi-tool into the trap's locking mechanism. The rust made it stiff, unwilling to budge. He adjusted his grip, applied more pressure. Nothing. Come on, he muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. Another growl rumbled from the bear's throat, deeper this time. Agitation. Bang. Mark worked faster. He twisted the tool, pushed harder. His muscles strained. The trap groaned in protest, the metal biting further into the bear's leg as he fought to pry it open. And then, snap, the mechanism released. The bear let out a deafening roar. Mark stumbled back, heart slamming against his ribs as the massive beast thrashed, shaking free of the brutal metal jaws. The ground trembled beneath its weight. For a terrifying moment, Mark thought he had made a mistake. The bear was free. But now it was hurt, confused, and inches away from him. Mark held his breath. The grizzly's body quivered with exhaustion. It lifted its wounded leg, testing its freedom. Blood dripped into the earth. Then it turned its head, slowly, deliberately, and looked straight at Mark. The two locked eyes. A deep, heavy silence filled the air. Mark didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, without a sound, the bear took one slow, limping step backward. Then another. And then, just like that, it was gone. Mark collapsed to his knees, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was over. Or so he thought. For several minutes after the bear disappeared into the trees, Mark just sat there, hands resting on his knees, trying to steady his breathing. His entire body was trembling, not from the cold, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer intensity of what had just happened. He had freed a grizzly bear. And lived. He glanced at the rusted trap lying in the dirt, its jagged teeth now permanently pried open. Blood stained the metal, a grim reminder of the suffering it had caused. His jaw tightened in anger. Poachers. He had seen the devastation they left behind before, but never this close. Never this real. Mark took a deep breath and forced himself to his feet. He had to move. The last thing he wanted was to be lingering when, or if, the bear decided to return. He grabbed his gear and started heading back toward his camp, but his mind was still racing. The moment the trap snapped open, he had expected chaos. He had braced himself for the bear to react with instinctual rage, to swipe, to attack, to turn him into nothing more than a cautionary tale for reckless hikers. But it hadn't. It had simply looked at him. That moment, that intense, almost human stare, lingered in Mark's mind. It wasn't an animal's blind rage or mindless fear. It was something else. Something deeper. He shook his head. He was probably reading too much into it. Bears didn't feel gratitude, did they? Still, a strange feeling settled over him as he walked. The sun was dipping lower now, casting long shadows between the trees. He needed to get back before dark. He quickened his pace, but that uneasy sensation didn't fade. Then he heard it. A branch snapping behind him. Mark stopped dead in his tracks. His breath caught in his throat as the rustling grew louder, closer. The forest had been silent just moments ago. Now something was moving. Something big. His fingers tightened around the strap of his bag. His mind raced through his options. Should he run? No, running would only trigger a predator's instinct to chase. Should he climb a tree? Maybe, but grizzlies could climb too if they were motivated enough. Another step. Closer. Mark slowly turned his head. And his stomach dropped. There, standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was the bear. Mark's pulse roared in his ears. The grizzly was watching him, its dark eyes locked onto his. Its massive frame was still imposing, but something was different now. It wasn't standing aggressively. It wasn't growling. It wasn't limping away. It was just there. Watching. Mark's breath came in slow, measured exhales. He knew better than to make sudden movements, but his mind screamed for answers. Why was it here? A chilling thought crept into his mind. Was it following him? That made no sense. Bears didn't do that, especially not after an encounter like the one they had. It should have disappeared into the wilderness, back into its territory as far away from him as possible. And yet here it was. A lump formed in Mark's throat. The bear shifted slightly, the golden light of the setting sun catching in its fur. Its wounded leg was still stiff, but it stood strong. And then, just as quietly as it had appeared, it turned away. Mark watched, his heart pounding, as the bear lumbered off into the woods, vanishing between the towering pines, leaving him with nothing but questions. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the trees as Mark sat beside his small campfire, staring into the flames. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to settle. The bear. Why had it followed him? Mark had encountered wildlife before, wolves lurking at a distance, curious deer peeking from the brush, even a mountain lion once, though it had kept its distance. But a grizzly? Injured no less? That wasn't normal. Bears didn't track humans unless they had a reason. And that thought unsettled him. He glanced at the rifle resting beside him, an old but reliable lever action he carried for protection. He hadn't needed it yet and he hoped he never would. But something about tonight made him uneasy. The forest had gone quiet again. Too quiet. Mark had spent enough time in the wilderness to know that silence was never a good sign. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets, rustling leaves, and distant howls was gone. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. He wasn't alone. His grip tightened around his knife as he stood slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the glow of his fire. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest scent of something musky, animal. Wild. And then, a low growl, not from the bear. Something else. Mark's pulse spiked as he turned toward the sound. Just beyond the fire's reach, two glowing eyes stared back at him. Then another pair. And another. Wolves. A pack. His stomach twisted. A lone wolf wouldn't attack a human unless desperate. But a pack? They were calculating, patient. They knew their strength lay in numbers. Mark swallowed hard. He slowly reached for his rifle, keeping his movements measured, controlled. The wolves remained just outside the fire's glow, circling, their eyes flashing as they moved. Then, suddenly one of them lunged forward. Mark barely had time to react before a massive dark shape crashed through the trees. A deep, thunderous roar ripped through the night. The wolves scattered. Mark stumbled backward, eyes wide as he took in the sight before him. The bear. It stood between him and the retreating wolves, its massive form silhouetted against the firelight. Its injured leg trembled, but it held firm, letting out another earth-shaking roar. The last of the wolves disappeared into the darkness. Silence fell once more. Mark's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths as he tried to process what had just happened. The bear had protected him. What? It turned slightly, its dark eyes meeting his once more. For a moment, Mark felt something unspoken pass between them. An understanding, a strange connection that defied logic. And then, just as before, the bear turned and vanished into the night. Mark stood there for a long time, staring after it. He wasn't sure what had just happened. But one thing was clear. He owed the bear his life. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine as Mark stepped out of his tent. The events of the previous night still played on a loop in his mind. The bear had protected him. Not once but twice. What? He rubbed his temples trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the bear had its own reasons for driving the wolves away. But deep down Mark knew better. This wasn't normal. His stomach growled, pulling him from his thoughts. He hadn't eaten much since the ordeal and hunger was finally catching up. He reached into his pack, pulling out a protein bar. Not the most satisfying breakfast, but it would do. As he peeled back the wrapper, something caught his eye. Movement. His body tensed. He turned slowly, scanning the treeline. And then he saw it. The bear. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was closer this time, standing just a few yards away, its massive frame partially hidden behind a fallen log. But it wasn't just standing there. It had something in its mouth. Mark squinted. A fish. The bear took a few slow steps forward, then dropped the fish onto the ground. It grunted softly before lifting its head, watching him with those deep, intelligent eyes. Mark didn't move. Didn't blink. Was this a gift? His mind raced for an explanation. Bears weren't known for generosity. They were opportunists, scavengers, survivors. But this bear, this bear, was doing something he had never heard of before. It was repaying a debt. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. Carefully, he crouched down, extending his hand toward the fish but keeping his eyes on the bear. He half expected it to snatch the offering back, to react with aggression. But it didn't. It simply watched. A silent understanding passed between them. Mark picked up the fish, still fresh, its scales glistening in the morning light. He held it up slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you," he murmured, feeling foolish for talking to a bear, but somehow it felt right. The bear let out a low, satisfied rumble before turning away, lumbering back toward the trees. Mark exhaled, his hands shaking slightly as he looked down at the fish. He had read stories about animals forming bonds with humans, but nothing like this. This wasn't just survival. This was something more. And for the first time in his life, Mark realized, he wasn't just an observer in nature's world. He was a part of it. The fire crackled softly as Mark cooked the fish over the open flame, its rich aroma filling the air. He still couldn't quite believe what had happened. The bear had brought it to him. Not stolen. Not scavenged. Not taken by force. Given. Mark took a slow bite, the warmth of the meal spreading through his body. It was the best thing he'd eaten in days, but his mind was too occupied to enjoy it. He kept glancing toward the treeline, half expecting the bear to return. But the woods were quiet now. Peaceful. For the first time since the encounter, Mark allowed himself to relax. He stretched out on the ground, staring up at the sky, the distant shimmer of stars just beginning to appear. A week ago he would have never imagined this. The grizzly should have been a nightmare, a threat, a wild force of nature that existed beyond the realm of human connection. But now it felt like something else. Something deeper. As he drifted off into sleep, a single thought settled in his mind. This wasn't over. ####. The next morning. A crisp breeze rustled the trees as Mark packed up his gear, preparing for the hike back to civilization. His trip into the wilderness had been meant as a solo retreat. Just him, his camera, and the untouched beauty of nature. But it had turned into something else entirely. As he slung his pack over his shoulders, a familiar sound reached his ears, a heavy rustling in the underbrush. He turned. And there it was. The bear stood at the edge of the clearing watching him. Its injured leg was still stiff, but the wound looked cleaner now, healing. Mark took a slow step forward, then stopped. What was he supposed to do? Say goodbye? Thank it again? The bear huffed softly, tilting its head ever so slightly, almost as if it understood his hesitation. Mark smiled. You're something special, aren't you? He murmured. The bear blinked, then with one last lingering look, turned and disappeared into the trees. Mark watched it go, a strange warmth filling his chest. He didn't know if he'd ever see the bear again. But deep down he knew, this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning.